we'll start off with today's situation. Um, so Chauncey Billups was arrested for that was poker. That was not sports gambling related,
Mhm.
correct?
I believe that was poker, although those poker games, I think, were traps, were connected to, were, it sounds to me like those poker games were built to draw people into sports gambling, compromising situations, sports gambling. I'm not 100% sure about that, but when I was skimming it, it sounded like they were building that to draw people into into bad situations.
Sure. And then Terry Rozier, that one
Mhm.
that one is directly sports
Yeah.
gambling related. So I guess to start a pretty general question, I mean, even when I was growing up not very long ago, this wasn't a regular thing, and there have been multiple scandals recently. So how do we get to this point?
So I think one thing to know is that there have been periodic sports gambling scandals dating back to the beginning of, say, organized baseball in the 1870s. Occasionally, these things sort of flare up. Obviously, maybe the most famous one is the 1919 Chicago White Sox throwing the World Series, the Black Sox scandal, they call it, right? Where I think 8 players were involved in some way, shape, or form in throwing games. In the 1950s, college basketball was nearly destroyed through gambling scandals. Teams would sort of come to they had just invented point spreads, which is a sort of gambling where you don't have to give up a whole game. You can just give up points, and that sort of led to a raft of point shaving scandals in New York in the 1950s, and it nearly wrecked college basketball. And then periodically we see sports gambling come up in college sports and in basketball. Baseball, there was the Pete Rose scandal. So we've we've always had some of this. And one of the cases for legalized gambling, has been that it would make this easier to discover, right? That um, because it was all out in the open, the people who were taking the bets could communicate with the leagues and with law enforcement to point out when strange patterns showed up. And that's sort of what happened with Terry Rozier. Suddenly $200,000 are flowing in on these under bets. And so people started to sort of say, hey, wait a minute, that's a weird number, right? And that's the same thing that happened with Jontay Porter earlier in the year. So there's always been gambling. Gambling has always been sort of in the fabric of sports. It's always, growing up for me, it was always an undercurrent, something that was sort of winked at. They print the lines in the newspaper, but and occasionally the local sports columnist does his football picks against the spread. But for the most part, like the focus has not been explicitly on gambling as like a main vocation. That changed in 2018. The Supreme Court struck down the laws against most state laws against gambling, or the federal law that prevented states from legalizing gambling outside of Nevada, and so everyone really rushed in. States are eager for revenue, and gambling is popular. Like people like to do it. So, in some ways, these laws sort of pushed on an open door, but the legalization it's really exploded in these 7 years. You can't watch a game uh, being given sort of lines to bet or props to take on, right? It's everywhere. It's really constant for sports fans. I know a lot of sports fans are really frustrated with it.
Yeah, and with it happening, so yeah, you're talking about Jontay Porter. I know Malik Beasley was investigated, and
Mhm.
that one might pop back up, I've heard. Um, and then there was Otani's translator. There
Right.
were the pitchers with Cleveland. There were a few other
Hmm.
baseball players that had other sports bets. Um, so I mean, when it becomes a pattern, like you're mentioning, what makes that like concerning overall for a sports fan, even more than just
Yeah.
being bombarded with constant ads?
Yeah, I mean, you can't have sports if the games are not on the up and up, right? Professional wrestling is fun, but everybody knows that it's fake. If the games we're watching are not real, if they don't, uh, if it's not a fair competition, if the players aren't really trying, that just sort of destroys the purpose of sports. It destroys what makes sports exciting for us. And honestly, it just makes it like a fraudulent enterprise, right? If I want to watch If I want to watch made up competitions, I could just watch reality shows or wrestling, right? Sports wants to be something different. Furthermore, right, if those things end up being too fake, like why would we even have sports in high schools, right? Why would we want to let that into our sort of general kind of civic life? I think that's really the issue, is that part of what sports give us are sort of true competition. That's what they're selling us. Um, and it's part of what's fun about it. If we can't trust it, if it's not on the up and up, all the things we kind of like about it, all the things that make it an important social institution start to fall away.
So then this is a question that, maybe I partially know the answer to, but and most people might, but like for clarity, if it threatens sports, and obviously sports are such a big part of culture, why are states pushing to legalize it when obviously the Supreme Court allowed it, but they didn't require states to legalize it?
Right. I mean, I think every state is looking for money and for revenue, right? And so casinos were something that a lot of states embraced in the mid 90s. Because I grew up in Detroit. I'm very personally sad about Chauncey Billups, right? Mr. Big Shot, the great Pistons player. But states are always hungry for revenue, right? There's a reason why, as sort of federal laws have changed, states have moved to legalize drugs, legalize marijuana, for instance, or legalize gambling, or have casinos. States are looking for revenue, right? States need money to balance their budgets, and that tax money is really effective, right? It's really useful for them. Now, at what cost, right? To what extent are they creating new tax burdens to deal with later, right? As you deal with the downstream effects of these particular things, like gambling leaves people financial ruin, right? That's a concern, right? If you legalize something and it creates more social problems, then are you really, to what end are you saving that money? To what end are you creating that financial windfall by subsidizing a cultural ill, right? By making things worse.
Yeah, and then for states, I mean, I guess for states who have legalized it, but also even in Wisconsin, there are obviously plenty of people um, who sports gamble, whether that's at a Potawatomi or an Oneida casino, or through VPNs, or maybe they go to Michigan or something. What makes it so appealing that now we're seeing people do it so much?
I mean, it is kind of fun, right? I mean, I don't want to I don't, it's a hard thing to talk about because, there's an old phrase, the dose makes the poison, right? A bet here playing an NCAA tournament pool, like there's no problem with that, right? If you can stop, if you're somebody who can just do this for fun, or you play in a fantasy league with your buddies, right? That's a form of gambling too. And I don't see a problem with that. I don't think anybody really sees a problem with that. The problem, right, is the percentage of people who can't stop, right? And when people have an addiction, one of the things that they encourage you to do is to not put yourself in a position where you're going to be tempted, right? So if you have an alcohol addiction, you have two routes home, and one goes past a liquor store and one doesn't, maybe they encourage you to take the other one, right? When gambling's on our phone, if you are a problem gambler, if you can't stop yourself, you have to have a phone, right? Who doesn't have like this is 2025. Everyone's got to have a phone, it feels like. I'm sure people will email you and say, I have a flip phone, but that's not really the way that it works. Most people don't. Most people have a phone with apps. And so the app is going to be there. Like, how do you keep that off your phone? How do you get away from it? The problem with the thing that's changed about the thing about gambling that I think makes it a little different than legalizing weed and legalizing, casinos is that it is on our phones, right? It's not a thing you can get away from so easily, which means for people who have gambling addiction, people who gamble compulsively, who can't get away from it, can't stop themselves, or have trouble stopping themselves, you just can't get away from it. So it's really difficult.
And then yeah, you're saying it's a lot more accessible, even though gambling has always been something that's been there, an undercurrent even in sports. It's becoming more common. Does that make the financial reward for athletes more lucrative? Does that make it something that maybe they think is more acceptable if they have some involvement with? Is that part of the reason maybe that it's happening more?
I mean, so, when I was a sports writer, one of the things that so I used to be a sports writer, and there is a lot of like low stakes gambling that kind of happens within professional sports, right? The shooting contests for $50, right? That players will have after practice. Maybe it's a little more than 50, right? Card games on the airplane. I think Michael Jordan was famous for those intense card games on the back on the at the back of the Bills plane. When I was covering minor league baseball, there was like a daily home run pool, right? Just to what everyone put in $1, and whoever hit the last home run would get the pool that day, right? I mean, those things exist, right? It's a way of interacting with people. But this is one of those cases where athletes are just like us. Most people can, put a wager on a golf shot or put a wager on a card game, and that's enough for them. And some athletes, are going to be driven to do more, right? And they're competitive people, and the thrill of winning is something that I think they chase. And so, just like all of us. So yes, in this case, it's athletes are just like us. Some of us really like the thrill of winning something on top of the game and having that bet. And like I said, it's the dose makes the poison, right? One bet here, one bet there. I mean, I don't feel like that's that big a deal, but at some point when it gets out of your control, when you're putting the rent money on it, suddenly it's a real big problem.
Yeah. And then you also have mentioned, again, we go back to it being so prevalent now. You're talking
Mhm.
about the ESPN ad. This I was talking about ad on CBS Sports. Even all the leagues, at least I think all the major professional leagues have
Mhm.
partnerships with these, and even some stadiums have sports books within their
Sure.
stadiums. So how does that relationship play into it here? I mean, even back in 1919, talking about the Black Sox scandal, Pete Rose, all throughout that time, even 5 years ago, there wasn't any of that. Um, so I guess where does that relationship play into it? Is that a concern that maybe leads to it as well with the teams sort of turning a blind eye because they're even involved in it?
Mhm. It's an interesting question, right? Because in one sense, it's tempting to basically say, well, what do the leagues expect? But, I don't think it's unfair to say, the leagues have beer sponsors too, right? And I don't think it's unfair to say we don't want athletes to drink beer while in competition, right? So I think that it's not quite a what do you expect thing. That I'm going to go a little long on this, and you can cut or whatever, right? That the legalization of gambling does two things for sports leagues. One, it protects the value of their media rights deals, right? So for Fox is paying billions and billions of dollars to have NFL games, right? And the concern for the NFL is that it's got to deliver a consistent audience, week in, week out to Fox Television. Otherwise, next time through, they're not going to pay as much money. And gambling is one of those things that forces people to sit and watch the game because they want to track how their bet is doing. That's that's some group of people, right? So most of the people who are watching a Packers game on Fox 11 are going to be watching for the Packers because they're fans. But there are a few people who might be Vikings fans or who might be Bears fans who just live there who, maybe it's a fantasy player, maybe they put a punt on the over, right? But so everyone's got to have a reason to watch. And this is one of those things that protects the sports the rights of the main thing that funds the sports league, which are the television rights. And the second thing is sponsorship money, right? These are important sponsors. These are companies that will pay a lot of money to get exposure to your fans if you're a sports league. And you know, the two main sources of revenue for a major league team are television money and sponsorship money. And so it really checks both of those boxes.
And then are you willing to talk a little bit, not about Wisconsin, not so much about details of the bill, but just
Mhm.
like if Wisconsin were to adopt?
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully as people are thinking about whether this is something that we want, they're looking at the experiences in the states nearby that have legalized it, in Michigan, in Illinois, right? No state's a perfect model for any other state. But hopefully, as they're considering doing this, right, they're looking at some of the challenges that have popped up over there and in those other places to sort of figure out what it is, is there going to be mitigation, right? Are you going to have enough there for people who do get themselves into trouble? Because it's hard to build, we built this a zero tolerance policy. Certainly, like I can't say that I think that has stopped people from gambling, because people who really want to are going to do it. But you are just going to reach more people, which means more people are going to be exposed to this, which means more people are going to get into trouble, which means you're going to need to account for that. If you're a state government, you know, you are going to be asked to deliver some sort of social service response to this.
Yeah. And then looking ahead to the future, I mean, if uh if they're keep well, we keep seeing these scandals in sports, do you see any policy changes, or do you think this will just only proliferate and we'll probably keep seeing them continue because there's so much money involved?
And I have a hard time seeing how this particular toothpaste gets back in the tube, personally. Certainly, I could see greater regulation within sporting organizations, but in some way we're moving the opposite way. I think the NCAA announced yesterday that it's going to stop preventing athletes and coaches from betting on pro games. I mean, that to me, that just is that's a recipe for more scandal, right? Because it's not like college athletes don't know people who've gone to the pros and aren't getting information, right? It does seem like it just creates all these avenues for greater corruption, and ultimately comes down to the honor system. And listen, I think most athletes don't want to be in a position where they're compromising their sport, but it's real easy to let your money get away, when you're gambling, and it's not so easy to get out of debt.
Yeah. And then one other question too,
Mhm.
just to there, we've talked about them throughout, but just to get them in a more concise soundbite. So the different ways that basically athletes could participate in gambling that would be corrupt, essentially, would be, I mean, obviously there's the old school throwing the game, but that's not
Mhm.
really what happens anymore.
Right.
Um, I'm trying to think. There's like the spread.
Right. So there's point shaving, where you purposely don't score in moments when you could score. So that's sort of that's a lot of the 1950s and through 1980s scandals were very much point shaving. Um, the rise of prop bets, and these got regulated after Jontay Porter. So you can bet on a player to do something in a game, grab 12 rebounds, catch a touchdown, right? So prop bets are a way that individual players can have their own lines that they directly can affect, right? So in the Terry Rozier story, he went out 9 minutes into a game, so anybody who bet the over on any of his point totals was going to be out of luck. So there's that. But then there's smaller things, right? There's like passing information. So if you are a college football player, there's no prop bet about you, but there is a game line. If you know the quarterback has a broken toe and isn't going to play very well, college teams aren't required to put out injury reports in the way that the NFL teams are. So passing inside information becomes another way, that players can do that as well.
And I think we didn't mention earlier Damon Jones, the Cavs
Mhm.
coach, I think Cavs or Lakers, but he's one of them who was just involved today too for
Right.
passing information.
Yeah, like I said, like the creation of there's a reason why the NFL has rules about injury reports, right? It's to avoid there being inside information, right? And if you're pro sports are very clear about this, right? When a player is not going to play, there are rules about when you have to tell everybody. Um, College is not like that, right? The college sports, they don't require those things at all. Um, they give them out sometimes, but for the most part, they would rather not tell you at all. And so again, like if I, even in the age of NIL money, right? Like I could always use an extra $300 when I was in college. I'm sure everybody could. Um, it becomes a pretty clear avenue to get information from people.
That's all I had for questions. Anything else you wanted to share before I end the
I
recording?
mean, it's so shocking to me how quickly this all happened, but I kind of feel like we're just gonna that they're gonna that it just may be the case of the leagues have decided that knocking out a couple of athletes every year to a gambling scandal is okay to the price of doing business.